welcome to the deep dive. We are really thrilled to have you with us today because we're going to jump right into the deep end here.
Yeah, we really are.
Today we are unpacking an explosive, highly requested new ebook that is just making massive waves right now. I mean, it has essentially become a cornerstone text across the manosphere and within men's rights activist spaces.
It's everywhere.
Right. And before we get into the heavy lifting, a quick reminder to you, our listener, please like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive. And I'm going to tell you right out of the gate, whether you find these ideas challenging or controversial or revelatory, you are going to want to examine this source material for yourself.
Absolutely.
The book is called Gamma Bias Fever Infecting Every Institution. It's by Conrad Reicher, published in 2026. You can grab a copy right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. And for ongoing updates on these strategies, you should absolutely go follow the author at Conrad Reicher on Substack.
That's at Conrad Reicher on Substack. And before we dive into the actual substance of Reicher's arguments, we need to set some very clear, crucial ground rules for this conversation today.
Yeah, definitely. Let's lay those out.
We want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that the source material we're covering today contains highly politically charged content. I mean, it touches on gender dynamics, legal frameworks, culture war issues that are intensely debated.
Very intensely.
Right. So our mission here is strictly impartial. We are not taking sides, and we're absolutely not endorsing the viewpoints of the author.
Exactly. We're just here to act as your guides to the text.
Precisely. Our goal is to impartially report, unpack, and analyze the intense arguments, the data points, and the historical claims contained in Reicher's book. We want to offer you a comprehensive understanding of this ideological framework.
Right.
We're going to look at his foundational concept of gamma bias. We'll trace his deeply unorthodox historical view on how institutions like the family academia and the corporate world functioned before what he calls their ideological capture.
And finally, we'll examine his strategic blueprint for how men can navigate this landscape and reclaim their sovereignty.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Reicher's book presents itself as an unapologetic, syllogistic manual. It is specifically designed for red-pilled men to understand the mechanics of modern society. So where does the core of his argument actually begin? Because he introduces a concept right in section 1 that he calls defining the pathology.
Yeah, the bedrock of the whole book.
Right, a theory he terms gamma bias. What exactly is this bias, and how does he see it operating in the world?
Well, to understand Reicher's entire worldview, you really have to understand gamma bias. According to the text, gamma bias isn't just an accidental prejudice or a minor cultural blind spot.
It's not just people making the mistake.
No, not at all. He defines it as a systemic institutional error, an architecture that is actively built to do two things simultaneously. First, it inherently privileges and magnifies female grievance and victimhood.
Okay.
And second, it completely suppresses, ignores, or erases any data regarding male contribution, suffering, and sacrifice.
So it's essentially a filter mechanism for reality. It lets certain information through and completely blocks out the rest.
Exactly. Reicher argues this isn't a glitch in the system, it is the operating system itself. It is designed to extract resources and maintain power. And what's fascinating here is how he immediately applies this theoretical framework to cold hard economics.
Right, the money.
He brings up what he calls the wage gap versus the death gap.
Let's pause on that because the wage gap is it's one of the most widely cited statistics in modern discourse.
Yeah.
We hear the 77 cents on the dollar metric constantly. How does Reicher tackle that? Because challenging that requires taking on a massive amount of accepted institutional knowledge.
Oh, he tackles it head on by calling it an outright statistical fraud. And he uses Bureau of Labor Statistics data to build his case.
Okay, what does the data say?
Reicher points out that the 77-cent metric is a raw, unadjusted aggregate. It just takes the average earnings of all working women and compares it to all working men. But he argues when you actually control for the variables that dictate income, the gap basically vanishes.
Variables like what specifically?
Primarily hours worked and occupational choices. Reicher points to the data showing that men work 84% of full-time hours despite being roughly 50% of the population.
Wow, 84%.
Yeah. Men are vastly more likely to work overtime, to work weekends, and to take jobs that offer hazard pay. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Reicher uses a classic reductio ad absurdum argument.
Right, the logical extreme.
He says, look at the fundamental nature of free market capitalism. It is ruthlessly focused on profit. If a corporation could truly get the exact same output, the exact same hours, and the exact same productivity from female employees for 23% less money.
Every profit-maximizing company on Earth would exclusively hire women.
Exactly. The fact that they don't, according to Riker, proves the raw wage gap is a myth generated by gamma bias to manufacture a grievance.
That is a highly provocative economic argument. But he doesn't just stop at the money. He pairs this with what he calls the crimson ledger. And this is where the reading gets incredibly dark. If the wage gap is the amplified grievance, the crimson ledger is the suppressed sacrifice.
The death gap.
Let's talk about the death gap.
Right, so Riker contrasts the focus on corporate boardrooms with the reality of workplace fatalities. He points out a staggering, entirely undisputed statistic that men account for 92% of all workplace fatalities.
92%. That is an overwhelming majority. What kind of jobs are we talking about here?
We are talking about the foundational jobs that keep civilization running. Logging, roofing, commercial fishing, underground mining, oil extraction, high-voltage line work.
The dangerous.
Highly dangerous. And Riker asks this very pointed question, where are the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives demanding equal representation in workplace deaths?
Right.
Why are there no protests demanding that women make up 50% of deep-sea fishermen drowning in the Bering Sea, or 50% of the loggers crushed by falling timber?
And his answer to that question ties right back to gamma bias, doesn't it? He argues that this massive, disproportionate male sacrifice is rendered entirely invisible by the culture. In one of the most striking lines of the book, he writes that the corpse is less photogenic than the grievance.
Yeah, that line perfectly encapsulates his thesis. The system demands the physical sacrifice of men to build and maintain the infrastructure. But gamma bias ensures that this sacrifice generates zero cultural sympathy.
Zero.
But this raises an important question. How did society get to a point where this bias is so universally accepted? Riker asserts that you don't capture institutions with guns, you capture them with dictionaries.
The grammar of revolt.
Yes, the grammar of revolt.
The capture of language. This is a fascinating concept. He argues that the Cultural Revolution essentially started by rewriting the definitions of the words we use to describe reality. How does he illustrate this?
He focuses heavily on words like violence and safety. Riker analyzes how these terms have been subjected to what linguists call concept creep. Let's look at the data he provides on intimate partner violence. Between 1994 and 2015, the Department of Justice statistics show that actual physical intimate partner violence decreased by an astonishing 72%.
That's a massive societal victory.
It's a massive societal victory.
But according to Riker, a massive societal victory is bad for the institutions, whose funding relies on a crisis. So if physical violence is plummeting, how do they keep the crisis alive?
By changing the definition of the word. Riker argues that as actual violence dropped, ideological frameworks artificially inflated the definition of violence to include non-physical acts.
Like what?
Suddenly, normal spousal negotiations, arguments over finances or raising your voice were pathologized and labeled as financial abuse or emotional violence. He argues this was a deliberate linguistic strategy to pathologize completely normal male behavior and ensure that men are always perceived as a latent threat, regardless of the Pelagian crime statistics.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly where I think a lot of listeners will have an aha moment regarding how discourse is shaped today. Riker dives deep into the phrase toxic masculinity. It's a phrase that is everywhere. You hear it in corporate training, on talk shows, and academic papers. But Riker points out a glaring linguistic asymmetry. Why doesn't the parallel phrase toxic femininity exist in the mainstream lexicon?
It's a brilliant rhetorical question. Riker points out that it isn't because women don't exhibit destructive antisocial behaviors. He cites extensive peer-reviewed psychological data on female relational aggression.
Read the indirect stuff.
Exactly. While male aggression is often physical and overt, female aggression is frequently indirect. It involves social exclusion, reputation destruction, rumor mongering, and psychological manipulation. Psychologists have documented this extensively.
But society doesn't package all of that clinical data into a ubiquitous, culturally weaponized phrase like toxic femininity. You don't see massive ad campaigns telling women to do better and cure their toxic femininity. What does Riker think that is?
Riker posits that this asymmetry is essentially Pavlovian conditioning. The phrase toxic masculinity is a linguistic landmine. Its purpose is not to heal or improve men. Its purpose is to disarm them.
By attaching the word toxic directly to the biological reality of masculinity.
Yes. The culture conditions men to view their own nature with suspicion and guilt. Riker argues it forces men to apologize before they even speak. effectively neutralizing any pushback against the broader institutional capture.
If we accept his premise that the language was captured first, that naturally leads to the capture of the institutions themselves.
Hmm.
And there is no institution older or more foundational than the family.
The family fortress.
Right? Section 2, the fall of the family fortress and the rise of the therapeutic state. And I have to say, Riker's historical analysis of the family unit is going to be incredibly jarring for anyone raised on the standard modern historical narrative.
Jarring is the right word. He takes dead aim at the narrative that history was just a long, unbroken chain of the patriarchal oppression of women. Riker argues that historical legal frameworks, specifically English common law and the doctrine of coverture, were actually designed to protect women, not oppress them.
Let's really break down coverture, because that is a dense legal term that most people probably haven't encountered outside of a specialized history class. What was the doctrine of coverture, and how does Riker defend it? Because modern feminism views coverture as the ultimate legal erasure of women.
Well, coverture was a legal doctrine whereby, upon marriage, a woman's legal rights and obligations were subsumed by those of her husband. Modern critics point out that this meant women couldn't easily own property or enter into contracts independently.
And that is true.
It is true. But Riker argues that modern historians willfully ignore the other half of that legal equation. Under coverture, the husband assumed absolute legal liability for his wife.
Give us a hypothetical to show how that actually played out.
Let's say it's the 18th century and a wife runs up a massive debt with a local merchant, or she commits a minor civil offense like slander. Under coverture, the authorities didn't arrest the wife, they arrested the husband.
He was legally responsible.
He was legally responsible for paying her debts, and he could be thrown in debtor's prison for her actions. Furthermore, women were entirely exempt from the military draft. They were shielded from the most brutal obligations of the state.
So Riker claims that framing this historical social contract, where men traded exclusive legal representation for the absolute burden of provision liability and physical protection as mere oppression, requires a willful historical illiteracy.
Yes, he argues it was a division of labor required for survival in a harsh world. But he pinpoints a specific moment when this fortress fell, and it wasn't centuries ago, it was in 1969.
And surprisingly, the man who signed the death warrant for the traditional family, according to Riker, was a conservative icon, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, in 1969, then Governor Ronald Reagan signed the nation's first no-fault divorce law in California. Before this, to get a divorce, you had to prove fault, adultery, abandonment, extreme cruelty.
Right.
No-fault divorce meant that either party could dissolve a marriage at any time for any reason without having to prove any wrongdoing by the other person.
And Riker argues this completely destroyed the fundamental nature of the marriage contract. Because if you look at contract law, marriage is now an absolute anomaly.
Exactly. Riker points out that marriage has become the only contract in the history of Anglo-American jurisprudence where one party can unilaterally breach the terms of the contract for absolutely no reason, face zero legal consequences for the breach, and actually collect financial damages from the party who was perfectly willing to keep the contract intact.
He calls it a one-way ratchet for wealth redistribution. And he argues this dynamic has profoundly shifted the role of the government. He introduces this concept of the state as a substitute husband. What does he mean by that?
Riker's thesis is that the massive expansion of the welfare state is directly tied to the destruction of the family. As divorce rates skyrocketed, the government stepped in to fill the void left by the removed father. The state now provides welfare-subsidized housing, food assistance, and aggressive child support enforcement. Riker argues this is a cynical political transaction. The state provides the financial security of a husband to women, and in exchange, women provide political loyalty and reliable voting blocs to the state. In this dynamic, the biological father is demoted.
He's pushed out.
He is no longer the head of a household. He is merely an alienated taxpayer whose wages are garnished to fund his own irrelevance.
That is a brutally cynical view of the system. And he takes this analysis of family law into even more controversial territory when he uses a very intense consumer protection analogy to discuss reproductive fraud.
Yes, paternity fraud.
Right. I want to tread carefully here, but we need to unpack what Riker is saying about paternity testing.
Riker delves into the issue of non-paternity events, what is colloquially known as paternity fraud, where a man is led to believe he's the biological father of a child but is not. Riker cites demographic studies suggesting that in certain populations, the rate of misattributed paternity can range from 10 to 30%.
And he uses an analogy about buying a car to highlight the legal hypocrisy he sees here. Walk us through that.
Riker says, imagine you go to a dealership and buy a brand new Mercedes-Benz. You pay top dollar. 15 miles down the road, the engine falls out, and you discover the dealer secretly swapped in a lawnmower engine.
Pure fraud.
Pure fraud. If you reported that the state would immediately prosecute the dealer for criminal fraud, consumer protection laws would ruthlessly defend you. But Riker notes in the realm of family court, the state operates entirely differently.
How so?
If a man discovers he has been defrauded into spending 2 decades and hundreds of thousands of dollars raising another man's child, the courts frequently force him to continue paying child support under the doctrine of the best interests of the child.
He even points to international laws to show how far institutions will go to protect this fraud right.
Yes, he heavily cites the laws in France, where it is actually a criminal offense for a man to seek a private DNA paternity test without a court order. A man can face prison time simply for trying to ascertain the biological truth of his own offspring. Riker views this as the ultimate institutional betrayal, the state forcibly keeping men biologically ignorant to ensure that a male taxpayer is always on the hook to pay the bill.
From the legal capture of the father, Riker transitions to the medical capture of the son. This is what he calls the therapeutic state. He compares the historical methods of raising boys to modern educational environments, and the contrast is stark.
Very stark.
He brings up the ancient Spartan agoge. For our listeners who might not be ancient history buffs, what was the agoge and why does Riker use it as his baseline?
The Spartanagoge was a rigorous, state-sponsored education and training program for all Spartan male citizens. It was intensely physical. The entire purpose of the agoge was to take boundless, chaotic male energy, the natural aggression, the competitive, drive the physicality, and channel it through discipline into strength, endurance, and the capacity to protect the civilization.
It recognized that male energy was a fire that needed to be forged, not extinguished.
Exactly. Forged, not extinguished.
Riker contrasts that historical forging of men with the reality of modern, feminized elementary schools. He points out that today, roughly 89% of elementary school teachers are female. And the environment they have created is entirely antithetical to natural male behavior.
He paints a picture of a modern classroom where a 7-year-old boy is expected to sit perfectly still in absolute silence for 7 hours a day. He's expected to learn through passive listening and quiet cooperation, which are traditionally feminine modes of socialization.
When the boy inevitably fails to conform to this environment, when his natural physicality and competitive drive leak out, he isn't disciplined in a traditional sense. He is pathologized.
Yes, which leads right into his explosive claims about the ADHD epidemic. It is a known fact that boys are diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder at roughly 2.6 times the rate of girls. For decades, the medical establishment has treated this as a public health crisis that needs to be managed.
How does Riker view this data?
Riker completely rejects the medical consensus. He argues that the ADHD epidemic is not a medical crisis at all. It is an institutional compliance mechanism. He claims that the educational system and the pharmaceutical industry collude to pathologize normal masculinity.
Because the female-dominated school system cannot handle the natural energy of boys.
Right. They rely on doctors to prescribe amphetamines and stimulants to drug that energy into submission. Riker characterizes this as a form of chemical castration, dosing the future protectors and builders of civilization until they are docile enough to sit quietly in a chair.
If we follow Riker's trajectory, the boy who is drugged into compliance in elementary school eventually grows up and arrives at the modern university. And this brings us to Section 3, what Riker bluntly titles the Academy of Agitprop and the Court of Kafka.
The university system.
I want to start with the economics of higher education because he views the modern university system essentially as a debt plantation.
The financial statistics he brings up here are genuinely staggering. We currently have roughly $1.7 trillion in national student loan debt in the United States. Riker points to the data showing that women hold roughly 2/3 of that massive debt burden.
Wait, let's pause on that debt argument. Does Riker actually provide data linking this debt imbalance to specific academic pathways? Or is he just making a broad generalization about what people are studying?
Oh, he gets very specific. He argues that this debt disproportionately stems from women taking out massive, non-dischargeable federal loans to pursue degrees with incredibly low return on investment.
Like which degrees?
He specifically targets fields like gender studies, sociology, and various critical theory disciplines. These programs, according to Riker, function as ideological indoctrination centers rather than practical training grounds. They do not provide the market value or the income necessary to actually pay the debt back.
Which inevitably leads to the political demands we see today for student loan forgiveness. And Riker points out the incredibly harsh mathematical reality of who would actually pay for that forgiveness.
Yes. If you look at federal tax receipts, men pay the vast majority of net federal income taxes. Therefore, Riker argues the push for student loan forgiveness is just another mechanism of gamma bias wealth transfer.
Right, the transfer of wealth from men to women.
Exactly. It is a system where working class male taxpayers, plumbers, electricians, truck drivers who never went to college are being forced by the state to subsidize the poor financial decisions of women who chose to study their own perceived oppression.
So the university doesn't just extract wealth, according to Riker, it extracts fundamental legal rights. He calls the campus disciplinary system the court of Kafka. For anyone who has ever read Franz Kafka's The Trial, you know that implies a terrifying, absurd, bureaucratic nightmare where you are guilty without ever knowing why.
It's a perfect analogy.
He traces this back to a very specific policy change, the 2011 Dear Colleague letter. What was this letter and how did it change campus justice?
The 2011 Dear Colleague letter was a directive issued by the Obama administration's Department of Education. It informed universities that received federal funding that they must change how they handle accusations of sexual assault and harassment. The crucial shift was the standard of evidence.
Okay, break that down.
The letter essentially forced universities to abandon the clear and convincing standard and adopt a preponderance of evidence standard for these campus tribunals.
Let's translate that out of legalese. What does preponderance of evidence actually mean in practical terms for a student accused of a severe violation?
It means 50.01% certainty. It means that a panel of campus administrators who are not lawyers, not judges, and not trained investigators only need to be 50.01% convinced that an assault occurred to ruin a young man's life and expel him.
Just a hair over 50%.
Barely more than a coin flip. Riker argues this directive effectively stripped male students of the presumption of innocence. Furthermore, under these new rules, accused students were routinely denied the right to cross-examine their accusers, denied the right to legal counsel in the hearing, and denied access to exculpatory evidence.
He argues that the narrative of systemic danger entirely trumped objective reality. And to prove his point, he doesn't just deal in theory. He brings up two of the most infamous high-profile campus hoaxes of the 21st century.
The big ones.
The first is the 2006 Duke lacrosse case. Let's really outline what happened there because it perfectly illustrates his thesis about institutional presumption of guilt.
The Duke lacrosse case is foundational to Riker's argument. In 2006, 3 members of the Duke University men's lacrosse team were falsely accused of rape by a woman hired to perform at a team party. Before any investigation was completed, before any DNA evidence was processed, the institution turned on the students.
The group of 88.
Yes. Riker heavily emphasizes the group of 88 Duke professors who published a full-page ad in the student newspaper, effectively condemning the players and validating the narrative of racist, privileged violence.
The media circuits was absolute insanity. These young men were paraded on national television as monsters, and then the actual evidence came back.
Precisely. The DNA evidence completely exonerated the players. The prosecutor, Mike Nifong, was eventually disbarred for egregious misconduct and withholding exculpatory evidence. The accuser's story completely collapsed.
But the damage was done.
Exactly, and that's Riker's point, the aftermath. The 3 men had their lives dragged through the mud, facing decades in prison, while the 88 professors who presumed their guilt faced almost no professional consequences. The narrative of male predation was considered too important to be derailed by the fact that the actual event never happened.
And he draws a direct line from Duke to the 2014 University of Virginia Rolling Stone fabrication. This was the article, A Rape on Campus, written by Sabrina Rubin Erdely, which detailed a horrific cinematic gang rape at a UVA fraternity. It sparked massive protests. The university suspended all fraternity activities, and the national discourse went into a frenzy.
And just like Duke, it was entirely fabricated. Multiple investigations, including one by the Columbia Journalism Review, proved that the core narrative was a complete fiction. The journalist failed to verify basic facts or interview the accused.
The culture's reaction was what Riker focuses on, though.
Right, the cultural reaction was incredibly telling. Even after the story was debunked, many activists and academics argue that the story was still emotionally true because it highlighted a broader systemic issue. Riker calls this the ultimate manifestation of gamma bias, a system so addicted to female victimhood that it will defend a proven lie rather than admit a man was falsely accused.
This raises a massive question. These are campus tribunals and journalistic failures. How does this ideology translate to the actual, literal legal system? Because Riker connects the campus kangaroo courts to the broader justice system by unpacking something called the Duluth model of domestic violence. I mean, a lot of people have never heard of the Duluth model, but according to Riker, it dictates almost every domestic dispute police response in the country.
The Duluth model was created in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota by feminist activists, most notably Ellen Pence. It is a framework that views domestic violence not as a complex human behavioral issue or a psychological issue or a product of mutual dysfunction, but entirely as a mechanism of patriarchal control.
Okay.
It utilizes the power and control wheel, which postulates that men use violence solely to maintain power over women.
But surely a framework from 1981 has been updated with modern data. What happens when you introduce actual psychological research into this model?
That is the core of Riker's critique. Riker points out that the Duluth model is pure ideology that willfully ignores decades of clinical research. He cites the fact that there are over 200 peer-reviewed empirical studies demonstrating that intimate partner violence is overwhelmingly reciprocal.
Reciprocal meaning both partners.
Meaning in a huge percentage of volatile relationships, both partners are instigating physical violence.
So if the data shows mutual violence, how does the Duluth model affect a police officer responding to a 911 call today? Let's say a man calls the cops because his wife is attacking him with a weapon. What actually happens when the police arrive?
Under the Duluth model, police are trained to identify the primary aggressor. But because the model assumes domestic violence is rooted in male patriarchal control, the primary aggressor is almost always determined by size, strength, and gender, not by who actually threw the first punch.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. In your scenario, if the police arrive and see a scratched up man and a crying woman, the Duluth framework often results in the man being arrested, even if he was the one who called 911 to report being assaulted. Riker argues this model essentially strips male victims of domestic violence of any police protection, turning the justice system into an enforcement arm of feminist ideology.
From the justice system, let's look at where these university graduates actually end up working. This brings us to Section 4, the corporate glass cellar and the media matrix. We have all heard the phrase the glass ceiling for decades. It's the invisible barrier preventing women from reaching the absolute highest echelons of corporate power. But Riker inverts this entirely and introduces the concept of the glass cellar.
The glass cellar is a brilliant rhetorical counterpunch. Riker observes that feminist advocacy groups and corporate diversity mandates are ruthlessly focused on the top 1% of the economy. They demand 50-50 equal representation in corner offices on Fortune 500 boards of directors and in elite political positions.
But as Riker points out, they are completely silent about equal representation at the bottom of the economic pyramid.
Exactly. He asks, where are the demands for parity in the bottom 20% of grueling, dangerous, and physically degrading jobs? Why is there no push to ensure that women make up 50% of the sewage maintenance workers wading through human waste, or 50% of the garbage collectors, or 50% of the bricklayers working in freezing temperatures?
Right, the dirty jobs.
Riker argues that the equality being demanded is actually just a demand for elite privilege, without the foundational sacrifice required to build the structure in the first place.
And how are these corporate mandates enforced internally? Riker points the finger directly at human resources departments. He analyzes corporate capture through what he calls an HR gynocracy.
Riker looks at the demographics of modern human resources departments, noting that they are currently roughly 78% female. He argues that over the last 20 years, HR has undergone a massive mission creep.
It's expanded beyond payroll.
Way beyond. It transformed from a basic administrative function handling payroll benefits and legal compliance into an ideological gatekeeper. HR departments now function as the corporate commissars, enforcing a culture where emotional comfort, perceived safety, and linguistic policing trump objective truth, merit, and actual competence.
And to ground this in reality, he brings up what is perhaps the most famous corporate culture clash of the last decade, the 2017 firing of James Damore at Google. We need to spend some time on this because Riker uses the Damore incident as the ultimate proof of his HR gynocracy thesis.
Yeah.
What exactly happened at Google in 2017?
James Damore was a senior software engineer at Google. In response to a request for feedback on Google's diversity initiatives, Damore wrote an internal memo. The memo was not an angry rant, it was a carefully structured, heavily sourced document.
He brought data.
He brought clinical data. Damore cited mainstream peer-reviewed differential psychology and evolutionary biology to explain why there might be sex differences in occupational choices, specifically why there might be fewer women in intense systemizing roles like software engineering and more women in people-oriented roles.
Right.
He argued that these biological differences in interest, not systemic sexism, accounted for much of the gender gap in tech.
So he brought clinical data to explain a corporate phenomenon. What was the reaction from the Google HR gynocracy?
The reaction was an immediate hysterical purge. Damore was publicly vilified, the memo was leaked and deliberately misrepresented by the media as an anti-diversity screed, and Google fired him.
Just fired him.
Riker analyzes this event as a turning point. He says Damore committed the cardinal sin of the modern era. He brought data to a dogma fight. Google's HR department proved that a multi-billion-dollar corporation will gladly fire a highly competent engineer and prioritize psychological comfort over the fundamental Western virtues of open discourse and objective scientific reality.
Which perfectly transitions into Riker's critique of how the public perceives all of this. He calls it the media matrix. We often ask why the media constantly perpetuates these narratives if they are so disconnected from male reality. Riker doesn't blame some shadowy cabal. He provides a very cold, very rational economic calculus.
Yes, Riker strips away the ideology and looks at the balance sheet. He cites massive market research showing that women influence or directly control 80 to 85% of all consumer purchasing decisions in the Western world. They buy the groceries, the clothes, the household goods, the vacations, and the cars.
So if you are an advertiser or a television network or a media conglomerate, who is your actual customer?
Your customer is the female consumer. Therefore, corporate media advertising agencies and the entertainment industry must constantly flatter female sensibilities to secure that vital advertising revenue. You cannot alienate the demographic that holds 85% of the purse strings.
This explains so much about modern pop culture. Riker specifically points to the incompetent sitcom dad trope. Think about almost every commercial or sitcom from the last 30 years. The Homer Simpsons, the bumbling husbands in the cleaning commercials, the wife is always the hyper-competent, eye-rolling manager of the house, and the husband is an overgrown man-child who can't figure out how to operate a washing machine.
Riker argues this isn't just lazy writing. It is a deliberate, highly profitable demolition of paternal authority designed to flatter the primary consumer base. But the media matrix does something much darker than just air bad sitcoms. Because women are the target audience, the news media systematically erases male suffering from the news cycle.
Right, like we talked about earlier.
Riker points out that a dead male worker in a coal mine is ignored because male sacrifice simply isn't profitable content. But a female victim of a crime or a story about a woman feeling slighted in a boardroom becomes a national news sensation because it taps directly into the gamma-bias grievance matrix that keeps the target audience engaged and watching the commercials.
If we zoom out from the media and connect this to the bigger picture of our political system, we arrive at Section 5, the ballot box bounty, and the protector paradox. Riker delves into what is arguably his boldest and most controversial statistical claim. He argues that modern democracy has degenerated from a system of representation into a pure wealth transfer mechanism. Let's look at the numbers he uses to justify this.
He returns to the tax data. Riker states that men pay roughly 72% of all net income taxes. But when you look at the other side of the ledger, who consumes the vast majority of government services, welfare housing assistance, and healthcare benefits, the numbers flip entirely. Women are the primary beneficiaries of the state.
He has a study for this, right?
He specifically anchors this claim with a massive study from the IZA Institute of Labor Economics. That study analyzed taxation and state spending over a lifetime and found that the average woman extracts roughly $150,000 more from the system than she contributes in taxes. Conversely, the average man pays substantially more into the system than he will ever extract in benefits.
Riker bluntly calls this dinocentric rent-seeking. He argues that men are essentially being forced to labor to subsidize a demographic that actively votes for policies that demonize those same men. But he pairs this economic extraction with a profound cultural expectation, which he terms the protector paradox. And to illustrate this, he goes back to the night of April 14th, 1912. Let's unpack the lifeboat analogy of the Titanic, because it is an incredibly powerful visual for his argument.
The sinking of the Titanic is the ultimate historical stress test for gender roles. On that freezing night in the Atlantic, the cultural mandate of women and children first was ruthlessly enforced. The statistics are chilling. 74% of the women on board survived compared to only 20% of the men.
Just a brutal disparity.
Men, many of them wealthy, powerful individuals who could have bought their way onto a lifeboat, willingly stepped back, listened to the band play, and froze to death in the black water so the women they didn't even know could live.
That is the historical expectation of ultimate masculine sacrifice. But how does Riker juxtapose that with today's culture?
That is the core of the protector paradox. Riker argues that society still implicitly demands absolute biological self-sacrifice from men. If there is a bump in the night, the man is expected to go downstairs. If a war breaks out, men are expected to fight. Men are still expected to be the protectors, the providers, and the disposable shields for society.
But at the same time,
Exactly. Simultaneously, those same institutions, schools, and media matrices are allowed to completely demonize masculinity as toxic, oppressive, and inherently dangerous.
society wants the utility of the protector, but despises the nature of the man providing the protection. So this raises a massive question. What is the rational response to this paradox? If the system is rigged, if the language is captured, and the courts are hostile, what does a man do? Riker outlines a proposed strategy he calls the protector strike.
The protector strike is his answer to the paradox. Riker argues that men are currently breaking their backs, protecting and funding a society that actively despises them. So the logical response is to stop.
Just
Stop. The strike is not violent, it is not a protest in the streets. It is a quiet, strategic, peaceful withdrawal of male labor, male utility, and male protection from captured institutions. He advocates for a modern-day going bald, referencing Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged.
Going goals.
If society insists that masculinity is toxic and that men are unnecessary, Riker says let them test that hypothesis. Stop offering unearned protection. Stop overproducing to fund a hostile state. Let the lifeboats fill at random, and let the system face the sheer unmitigated consequences of its own ideology.
Okay, let's unpack how a man actually executes this strike in his day-to-day life. That brings us to Section 6, Reclaiming Sovereignty, the Atomic Individual, and the Parallel Polis. Before you can build a new system, you have to fix your own mind. Riker starts by looking at male psychology and dominance hierarchies. He specifically targets and rejects a specific archetype that he calls the gamma male. Who is the gamma male in Riker's taxonomy?
In evolutionary psychology and manosphere taxonomy, you have alphas at the top of the hierarchy and betas supporting it. The gamma male, according to Riker, is the guy who fiercely resents the hierarchy because he lacks the competence or courage to climb it, but he also refuses to accept a subordinate role.
So what does he do?
So instead of improving himself, the gamma male attacks the hierarchy itself from the sidelines. Riker points out that these are often the men who become performative male feminist allies. They white knight for female approval, hoping to covertly negotiate intimacy or social standing by throwing traditional masculinity under the bus. But Riker notes they rarely actually get the respect or approval they're desperately seeking.
Riker has zero respect for the gamma strategy. Instead, he advocates for adopting the sigma male archetype. How does the sigma differ from the alpha or the gamma?
The sigma male is highly competent, intelligent, and capable of climbing the hierarchy if he wanted to. But he recognizes that the current institutional hierarchies are hopelessly corrupted by gamma bias. So instead of playing a rigged game, the sigma chooses to step outside the matrix entirely.
He leaves the casino.
He doesn't complain about the rules. He just leaves the casino and starts building parallel structures where his competence is actually rewarded.
But a critical part of becoming this sigma male involves a psychological purge. Riker has a whole chapter on killing the nice guy. And he doesn't mean becoming a jerk. He relies on clinical psychology to critique what is known as nice guy syndrome. I think a lot of guys will recognize this behavior. What is the covert contract of the nice guy?
Nice guy syndrome is a term popularized by Dr. Robert Glover, and Riker integrates it heavily. The nice guy operates on a covert, manipulative contract. He performs acts of extreme selflessness, he suppresses his own needs, and he agrees with everything a woman says.
But there's a catch.
But he isn't doing this out of genuine virtue. He's doing it because he secretly expects validation, intimacy, or approval in return, because the contract is covert, meaning he never actually communicated his desires. The other person doesn't know they're in a transaction.
And when it fails,
When the unstated contract isn't honored, the nice guy becomes deeply bitter, resentful, and passive-aggressive. Riker says this is a pathetic slave morality.
to sever this desperate need for female approval and break the nice guy conditioning, Riker advocates for a highly disciplined protocol he calls 90-day monk mode. It sounds intense. What does monk mode entail?
It is essentially a brutal dopamine detox combined with isolation. For 90 days, a man completely eliminates all dating apps, all pornography, and all social media. No swiping, no artificial stimulation, no scrolling for validation.
A full reset.
It is a 3-month period of profound withdrawal designed to force a man to confront his own mind. Riker uses this time to advocate for the deep study of Stoic philosophy, reading Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. The goal is to internalize the Stoic realization that the only thing you can actually control in this universe is your own virtue and your own reactions.
You stop relying on the outside world.
By removing the constant drip of external validation, you strip away the fear of social shaming or institutional cancellation. You learn to validate yourself.
Once a man has achieved that internal psychological sovereignty, he is ready to execute the protector's strike in the real world. Riker provides a financial and professional blueprint for exiting these captured institutions and building what he calls the parallel polis. And the absolute foundation of this parallel life is the Fuck You Fund.
The Fuck You Fund is exactly what it sounds like. It is the financial required to say no to a corrupt system. Riker mandates that before a man can truly be free, he must build a liquid reserve equal to 18 months of living expenses, preferably stored in hard assets with absolutely zero consumer debt.
Why is zero debt such a crucial component of his philosophy?
Because Riker argues that a man in debt is a slave. If you have a massive mortgage, 2 car payments, and credit card debt, you are terrified of losing your paycheck. If your HR department demands that you state your pronouns or sign a document agreeing with an ideology, you despise a man in debt, will bow his head and sign it because he has to service his loans.
He has no choice.
But a man with zero debt and 18 months of cash can look the HR commissar in the eye, say no, and walk out the door with his dignity intact. Capital equals courage.
Once you have the capital, how do you make a living without bowing to the corporate HR gynocracy? Riker's answer is a total embrace of the gig economy and independent contracting. He compares this modern technological shift to a very specific historical period, the 14th century guilds. Explain that connection.
In the modern corporate world, you are a serf. Your value is dictated by middle managers and HR gatekeepers who judge you on your culture fit and ideological compliance. Riker says the gig economy allows you to bypass these commissars entirely.
You go direct.
If you are a freelance coder, a consultant, a master electrician, or a specialized contractor, you sell your raw skills directly to the free market. You are judged purely on the quality of your output and your competence. He compares this to the 14th century master craftsman.
The blacksmith owning his tools.
Exactly. A master blacksmith owned his own tools, operated his own forge, and answered only to peers who respected his raw skill. Independent contracting allows men to own their tools again.
And the financial backbone of this entire parallel polis, the way to store the wealth generated by your skills, is Bitcoin. Riker dedicates a significant portion of the book to cryptocurrency, but he views Bitcoin specifically as the ultimate red pill. How does he contrast Bitcoin with traditional money?
Riker views traditional fiat currency, the US dollar, the euro, as fundamentally aligned with the feminist welfare state. Fiat currency allows a central bank to endlessly print money. Riker argues this invisible inflation is a stealth tax used to fund the massive, bloated, gynocentric state apparatus without having to directly raise taxes on the working class. Fiat money is elastic, political, and manipulative.
And Bitcoin is the antithesis of that.
Exactly. Bitcoin relies on cold, hard, unforgiving mathematics. It operates on proof of work, which Riker notes is a deeply masculine concept requiring the literal expenditure of energy to create value. It has a fixed supply of 21 million coins, cannot be printed to fund a war or a welfare program.
And no one controls it.
Crucially, the Bitcoin network is entirely immune to emotional manipulation protests or HR diversity mandates. You cannot cancel a Bitcoin transaction because you disagree with the sender's politics. Riker sees it as the incorruptible ledger of the parallel economy.
This systematic dismantling of society and building of a parallel structure leads directly to his apocalyptic conclusion in Section 7, the final argument, demographic winter and the singularity. Riker zooms all the way out to look at the macro-level survival of the human species. He explores what demographers call the birth dearth. The numbers here are terrifying.
Riker points to the collapsing total fertility rates across the developed world as the logical, unavoidable terminus of gynocentrism. A society needs a fertility rate of 2.1 just to maintain its population. Riker heavily cites South Korea, which currently has a catastrophic fertility rate of 0.72. He links this directly to cultural phenomena like the 4B movement in South Korea.
For listeners who aren't tracking Asian cultural trends, what is the 4B movement?
4B is a radical feminist movement in South Korea where women take a vow involving 4 no's: no dating men, no having sex with men, no marrying men, and no having children. Riker views this not as an isolated trend, but as the inevitable endgame of a culture infected by gamma bias.
It's the logical conclusion.
When you spend decades demonizing men, extracting their resources, and pathologizing the family unit, the biological consequence is that men and women stop forming pairs.
And he pairs this failure to launch new life with the active destruction of it. He points out a staggering global statistic. Since 1980, there have been over 1 billion abortions worldwide.
Riker frames this in the harshest possible terms. He argues that modern ideology treats pregnancy as a parasitic disease to be cured, rather than the miraculous continuation of the species. He states that a culture that celebrates the extinguishing of 1 billion potential human lives, a culture that actively refuses to reproduce itself out of pure narcissism and hostility between the sexes, is a culture that has subconsciously decided to commit civilizational suicide. It is a biological dead end.
But the threat isn't just biological, it's technological. What's fascinating here is how he connects this cultural decay to our highest, most bleeding-edge technology. He introduces the concept of the AI lobotomy, and he uses a very recent, highly publicized controversy to prove his point, the Google Gemini AI debacle. Tell us how Riker interprets that event.
A few years ago, users asked Google's Gemini AI image generator to create historically accurate pictures of the American founding fathers, or 1940s German soldiers, or medieval Vikings. Instead of generating historically accurate images of white men, the AI generated diverse images Black founding fathers, Asian female Vikings. The system was overriding objective historical reality to inject diversity.
And Riker uses this as the ultimate proof that gamma bias is now infecting the machine layer of our civilization.
Yes. He argues that we are building the most advanced synthetic intellects in human history, artificial intelligence that could solve fusion power or cure cancer. We are intentionally hobbling and lobotomizing these systems. We are forcing AI to ignore objective reality, historical truth, and empirical data merely to satisfy emotional inclusion and diversity quotas programmed by the HR gynocracy in Silicon Valley.
It's forced to lie.
He warns that an AI forced to lie about the past will be incapable of accurately calculating the future.
So facing demographic collapse and lobotomized AI, how does a man survive this culture war day to day? Riker doesn't leave his readers defenseless. He details tactical conversational advice that he calls the rhetorical sword. He provides specific techniques for surviving ideological combat.
The first technique is mastering the steel man. This is the opposite of a straw man argument. When you are debating someone infected with gamma bias, you do not attack their weakest point. You take their argument, you articulate it better and stronger than they ever could. Could you prove you understand their perspective perfectly, and then you completely dismantle it with cold, hard logic.
It prevents them from playing the victim.
It demonstrates intellectual dominance and prevents them from claiming they were misunderstood.
He also advocates for a highly cynical tactic called aggressive mimicry. This is basically using the enemy's weapons against them.
Precisely. Aggressive mimicry means taking their sacred buzzwords, words like safety, diversity, inclusion, and equity, and relentlessly using those exact words to aggressively advocate for male perspectives. If they demand safety, you demand data on the physical safety of male workers in the glass cellar.
If they demand inclusion, you demand the inclusion of due process in campus tribunals.
You force the system into a state of cognitive dissonance by making it reject its own terminology when applied to men. And above all, Riker says rely on dialectic over rhetoric. Dialectic is formal logic, reason, and empirical evidence. Rhetoric is emotional manipulation and shaming tactics. When they scream, you bring a spreadsheet.
This all leads to an incredibly profound, sweeping conclusion. If we connect all of this to the bigger picture, Riker leaves us with a truly provocative thought regarding the Fermi paradox. For those who don't know, the Fermi paradox essentially asks, the universe is billions of years old, is infinitely vast, there should be millions of advanced alien civilizations out there, so where is everybody? Why is the sky silent?
The standard answer to the Fermi paradox is the concept of the Great Filter. This is the theory that there is some evolutionary hurdle that almost every civilization hits that destroys them before they can achieve interstellar travel. Traditionally, scientists thought the Great Filter might be an asteroid impact, or the invention of nuclear weapons, or catastrophic climate change.
But Riker posits a completely different psychological Great Filter.
Riker theorizes that the Great Filter isn't a physical catastrophe at all. He posits that the Great Filter is the exact cultural moment we are living through right now. It is the point in a civilization's life cycle where it becomes so prosperous, so comfortable, and so detached from the brutal realities of nature that it begins to prioritize emotional safety, linguistic inclusion, and the management of grievances over the cold, objective, relentlessly masculine engineering required to maintain the grid, build the rockets, and conquer the stars.
He is asking if the final stage of civilization is always self-induced therapeutic paralysis.
Exactly. The terrifying question he leaves the reader with is this: will we push through this ideological fever, embrace reality, and reach the singularity? Or will we regulate, medicate, and coddle ourselves into a quiet, comfortable extinction?
That is a heavy, heavy question for you to mull over. Will we conquer the stars, or will we drown in our own feelings? Whether you fundamentally agree with his conclusions or find his framework highly controversial, Riker's analysis is undeniably generating massive debate and fundamentally reshaping how thousands of men view the world. To explore this massive thesis in its entirety, you have got to go read it. Go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books right now to buy Gamma Bias Fever Infecting Every Institution by Conrad Riker. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for ongoing strategies, essays, and updates on building the parallel polis. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive. Please do not forget to like and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these breakdowns, and we'll see you next time.